Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest moments in military history. The moment when an army looked at a giant enemy fortress and instead of saying, "let's attack it," decided to say, "let's build around it." So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because I always enjoy seeing where these journeys reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slowly step backward into ancient Gaul. The year is 52 before Christ, and for years Rome had been expanding like a machine that had forgotten how to stop. Villages fell one after another. Tribes disappeared into Roman territory, and Julius Caesar kept collecting victories with almost unsettling efficiency. Roman legions moved with a rhythm that terrified enemies. They marched for miles carrying armor, weapons, tools, and enough equipment to build camps every single night. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also engineers, builders, and experts at turning landscapes into weapons. Across Gaul, many tribes had resisted Roman expansion, and most had eventually learned a painful lesson. Fighting Rome directly usually ended badly. But then something changed. A man appeared who understood that defeating Rome did not necessarily mean defeating Roman soldiers. Sometimes it meant defeating Roman systems. His name was Vercingetorix, a young noble from the Arverni tribe, and unlike many leaders before him, he saw the larger picture. The tribes of Gaul had one major weakness. They were divided. They argued, competed, distrusted one another, and often fought among themselves. Rome loved this because Rome had practically built an empire around the idea of exploiting divisions. But Vercingetorix started doing something dangerous. He convinced tribes to unite. Suddenly, the Romans were no longer dealing with isolated rebellions. They were facing something much larger, something coordinated. And then he made Caesar's campaign even more frustrating by introducing a brutal strategy. If Roman armies depended on food from the countryside, then the countryside itself would disappear. Villages were burned, fields were destroyed, grain stores were emptied, wells were abandoned. Entire regions became silent landscapes of smoke and ash. Roman soldiers marched through places where food should have existed and found nothing except blackened ground and empty buildings. It was effective because no matter how disciplined a Roman soldier was, discipline alone could not replace dinner. For the first time in years, Caesar was dealing with an enemy who refused to play by the rules Rome preferred. Small attacks happened constantly. Supply lines became vulnerable. Movement slowed. Tension grew. But then Vercingetorix made a decision that would become one of the most famous military decisions in history. He withdrew his forces into the hill fortress of Alesia. At first, the choice looked brilliant. The settlement sat high above surrounding valleys with steep slopes protecting much of its position. Strong defenses surrounded the hill, and from above, warriors could watch every movement below. To the Gauls, it looked safe. To Caesar, it looked different. Caesar stared at the hill and saw something that Romans understood very well. He saw a container. And once Romans saw a container, they immediately started thinking about lids. Most commanders would have prepared ladders, siege towers, battering rams, and direct assaults against the walls. Caesar looked at the fortress and chose something stranger. He decided not to attack at all. Instead, he decided nobody would leave. Thousands of Roman soldiers spread across the landscape carrying tools besides swords. Trees fell beneath axes. Earth moved beneath shovels. Trenches appeared across fields. Wooden stakes rose from the ground. Day after day the Romans worked, while the warriors inside Alesia watched from above. At first perhaps they believed these were ordinary fortifications, temporary structures meant to support a coming assault. But the lines kept extending. More trenches appeared, more walls rose, more towers emerged from the earth. Slowly, an uncomfortable realization began spreading among the defenders. The Romans were not preparing to attack the fortress. They were preparing to imprison it. And there is something deeply unsettling about watching an enemy calmly build your prison while maintaining complete confidence that you are going nowhere. As the days passed, the strange Roman construction project continued growing across the countryside. And from the walls of Alesia, the scene must have looked almost unreal. Thousands of men moved below like parts of a giant machine. No confusion, no panic, no shouting chaos, only rhythm. Roman soldiers dug trenches during daylight, raised wooden walls before sunset, and returned to work mass. Next morning, as if surrounding an entire city was simply another item on a schedule. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched something deeply unsettling unfold. At first, many likely believed Caesar was preparing ordinary siege works, temporary structures meant to support an eventual attack. But every sunrise made the truth harder to ignore. The line kept stretching farther and farther until eventually a complete circle surrounded the settlement. It was no longer a siege in the normal sense. It was containment. Caesar had ordered the construction of a massive ring of fortifications around the entire hill. Deep trenches cut through the land first, wide enough to break advancing formations and deep enough to become deadly obstacles. Behind those trenches rose enormous earthen walls, strengthened with timber and lined with sharpened stakes. Towers appeared at intervals across the entire line, where Roman archers and artillery crews could watch every movement below and above. From the sky, it would have looked like some giant hand had wrapped a wooden chain around the hill itself. And inside, Alesia, something more dangerous than Roman weapons, slowly began arriving. Hunger. Because walls protect people from armies, but walls also trap whatever sits behind them. Food supplies that once seemed reasonable suddenly had to feed tens of thousands of warriors and civilians. Every day meant fewer animals, less grain, and smaller portions. At first, soldiers probably joked about it. Armies always joked during difficult moments because humor delays fear. Someone probably looked at the Roman camps below and laughed that Caesar intended to wait forever. Someone else probably insisted relief armies were already marching. Someone probably claimed Roman soldiers would become tired and leave. But days became weeks and confidence slowly turned into silence. The Romans kept building while the people inside kept counting supplies. Outside the walls, Caesar remained calm because he understood something important. Time itself had become a weapon, and unlike swords, time never became tired. But then distant riders began bringing news that changed everything. Across Gaul, Vercingetorix had already sent messages before retreating into Alesia. Messengers had traveled through forests and valleys, carrying one desperate request: unite. Every tribe that feared Roman domination now faced a decision: fight now or face Rome alone later. And slowly warriors began gathering. From distant settlements and hidden valleys, they came carrying shields, spears, and tribal banners. They crossed rivers and hills toward one destination: Alesia. Caesar soon received reports from scouts, and the information was unpleasant. A massive relief army was approaching. Ancient sources later claimed numbers exceeding 200,000 warriors, although historians suspect those figures were exaggerated because ancient commanders occasionally enjoyed making victories sound larger than reality. But even if the real number was smaller, the danger remained enormous. Caesar's army suddenly faced a nightmare situation. Behind them sat Vercingetorix and thousands of trapped warriors. Ahead of them, an enormous rescue force was moving across Gaul. The Romans were about to become trapped between two armies. Any ordinary commander might have considered retreat. Any ordinary commander might have abandoned the siege before disaster arrived. Caesar looked at the situation, thought carefully, and reached a conclusion so strange it almost sounds fictional. He decided they needed another wall, because apparently surrounding one enemy army was no longer enough. Now he intended to surround himself as well. Orders spread through the camps, and Roman soldiers returned to work without complaint, because Roman legions had developed an almost supernatural ability to treat impossible instructions as routine labor. A second line of fortifications began rising beyond the first. This one faced outward toward the open countryside where the relief force would appear. More trenches were dug. More walls climbed from the earth. More towers rose against the horizon. The Roman army now stood between two giant defensive rings, one facing inward toward Alesia and one facing outward toward the approaching army. Caesar had effectively locked his own soldiers inside a battlefield with enemies on both sides. If one wall failed, the entire system could collapse. If both armies attacked together at the right moment, Roman forces could be crushed. Yet despite the danger, work continued with almost terrifying confidence, because Roman soldiers trusted systems and Caesar trusted preparation. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, campfires of the approaching Gauls were beginning to appear beneath the night sky. And soon the strange siege at Alesia was about to become something much larger. Not just a siege anymore, but one of the most extraordinary military traps ever attempted in ancient history. Night after night, the hills around Alesia slowly began changing. What had once been open countryside was now filling with distant fires spread across the horizon like stars that had fallen onto the earth. Roman scouts returned to Caesar's camp, carrying the same reports again and again. More warriors were arriving, more banners were appearing, more tribes had answered the call. And with every passing hour, the relief army outside Alesia grew larger. Inside the fortress, the mood shifted immediately. For weeks, the warriors trapped behind the walls had watched Roman defenses rise higher, while their own food supplies shrank lower. Hunger had become an unwanted companion. But now hope returned. Men climbed the walls and looked toward the hills where thousands of campfires burned in the darkness. Somewhere out there, allies had come. Somewhere out there, Gaul had answered. Across the fortress, whispers became excitement, and excitement became confidence. Vercingetorix understood the moment immediately, because for the first time since entering Alesia, the trapped army no longer felt trapped. They only needed to survive a little longer. Outside the walls, the Roman camps looked calm. But beneath that calm, every soldier understood the reality of the situation. The enemy now existed in two directions. Behind them stood the warriors of Alesia. In front of them stood the arriving relief army. Between both forces stood Rome. Morning finally arrived, and with it came the first clear sight of the enemy. Across the valleys, enormous numbers of warriors spread through the countryside. Shields reflected sunlight. Spears rose above moving formations like forests of wood and iron. Horns echoed across the hills, and distant war cries rolled through the air. Ancient writers later described the scene almost like a flood pouring across the land itself. Even if those descriptions exaggerated the numbers, the psychological effect would have been impossible to ignore. Roman soldiers standing on towers suddenly saw hills covered with enemies in every direction. Somewhere inside Alesia, warriors on the walls shouted in celebration, while Roman officers quietly moved along defensive lines, checking positions and preparing for what came next. Caesar himself rode across the fortifications, observing every section because now preparation would face its test. Every trench, every tower, every sharpened stake buried in the ground was about to prove whether weeks of labor had been genius or madness. The first attacks did not come immediately. Instead, both sides spent time studying each other. The relief army searched for weaknesses in Roman defenses, while Roman scouts monitored movements outside the walls. Days passed beneath growing tension because everyone understood that eventually the attack would come. Then finally, the waiting ended. At dawn, the relief army moved. Thousands of warriors descended toward the Roman fortifications. From the towers, Roman soldiers watched long lines of advancing men spread across the fields. War cries rose louder and louder until the valleys themselves seemed to shake beneath the sound. The charge had begun. But between the attackers and the Roman walls sat Caesar's true weapon, the land itself. Warriors running towards the defenses suddenly discovered the first trenches cutting across the ground. Momentum slowed instantly as formations broke apart trying to cross them. Behind those trenches came hidden dangers buried beneath soil and brush. Men suddenly disappeared beneath the earth, screaming as sharpened stakes pierced feet and legs. Others stumbled into concealed pits. Chaos spread through the advancing formations because soldiers move effectively when they remain organized. But confusion destroys organization very quickly. And confusion was exactly what Roman engineering had been designed to create. Behind the obstacles, Roman archers and slingers began firing. Arrows darkened sections of the sky, while stones launched from slings struck advancing warriors with terrifying force. Ballistae mounted on towers hurled massive bolts into crowded formations below. Men attempting to climb the walls now faced attacks from above while struggling across terrain specifically designed to ruin movement. Still, the Gauls continued pushing forward because numbers created pressure, and pressure creates danger. Some groups reached the walls, and brutal fighting began across sections of the Roman line. Spears thrust through openings between wooden defenses, while swords flashed across narrow platforms and towers. For hours, combat continued without clear victory for either side. Then suddenly, a new sound rose behind Roman lines. Horns from Alesia. Vercingetorix had launched his own attack. The warriors trapped inside the fortress poured toward the inner walls, while the relief army attacked from outside. Caesar's nightmare had arrived exactly as expected. Roman soldiers now fought in opposite directions at the same time. Some defended outer walls against the relief force, while others rushed toward inner positions where warriors from Alesia attempted to break through. Across the entire system, messengers ran between camps carrying reports of attacks, weak points, and requests for reinforcements. Dust filled the air. Screams echoed across the valleys. The strange double ring Caesar had built was now becoming the center of one of the most chaotic battles in ancient history. Hours passed, and still neither side achieved decisive success. Roman discipline held, but pressure kept increasing. Again and again, warriors struck the defenses, searching for weakness. Again and again, Roman soldiers pushed them back. Yet everyone understood something uncomfortable. They could not continue forever. Eventually, someone would break. Eventually, somewhere along those 40 kilometers of fortifications, a weak point would appear. And when night finally covered the battlefield, neither side celebrated because everyone knew the real assault had not happened yet. Both armies had tested each other. Both armies had learned. And somewhere in the darkness, leaders prepared for something larger. Because the next attack would not be another test. The next attack would be everything. The final stage of the siege began beneath darkness and exhaustion. Across the Roman camps, men sat beside fading fires, cleaning blood from shields, repairing damaged armor, and eating whatever food they could find before sleep briefly claimed them. Very few slept comfortably. The previous attacks had shown everyone the same truth. The Gauls were strong, determined, and still dangerous. The Romans had held their lines, but only barely in some places. Somewhere along the massive ring of defenses, weak points existed, and both sides knew it. Beyond the Roman walls, the relief army was preparing something different. Their leaders had spent the night studying the landscape carefully. Earlier assaults had attacked broadly across the fortifications, testing every section. Now they believed they had found an opportunity. One area of Caesar's defenses sat near rough hills and uneven ground where the terrain made construction more difficult. The walls there were less protected by natural barriers, and the attackers believed this would become the place where Rome finally cracked. Before sunrise, thousands of chosen warriors quietly gathered beneath the darkness. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix prepared his own men for one final effort. The trapped army understood the situation perfectly. Food was nearly gone. Hope depended entirely on breaking the Roman lines. If the relief force failed, there would be nothing left except surrender. And so as morning approached, two separate armies prepared to strike at exactly the same time. Then the attack came. War horns shattered the morning silence, and suddenly the valleys exploded with movement. The relief army rushed toward the weak section of Roman defenses in enormous numbers, while at the same moment Vercingetorix unleashed his warriors from inside Alesia. Roman soldiers looked in both directions and saw enemies advancing everywhere. The battlefield became chaos almost immediately. Dust rose into the air until parts of the fighting disappeared beneath moving clouds of earth and smoke. Arrows crossed overhead. Horns sounded through the confusion. Officers shouted commands that vanished beneath the noise of battle. The relief force struck the outer walls with terrifying force. Men crossed trenches, climbed earthworks, and forced themselves through fields of hidden traps despite heavy casualties. Some sections of the Roman line began bending under pressure. Warriors reached defensive walls, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Spears broke, swords flashed, men fell from towers and disappeared into trenches below. For the first time during the entire siege, Roman defenses looked genuinely threatened. Reports quickly reached Caesar that one section of the outer line was close to collapsing. The relief army had concentrated thousands of warriors against a single vulnerable point, and Roman defenders there were struggling to hold. If that section broke, everything could collapse. Enemy forces would pour into Roman positions, and suddenly Caesar's entire army would find itself trapped between two larger forces. Years of conquest, victories, and campaigns could end here on a hill in Gaul. Caesar understood the danger immediately. Ancient accounts describe him riding directly toward the threatened position, wearing his distinctive red cloak so soldiers could see him clearly. Roman commanders usually avoided unnecessary risk during critical moments, but Caesar understood psychology as well as strategy. Soldiers fighting near collapse suddenly looked up and saw their commander arriving personally at the most dangerous section of the battlefield. And sometimes morale itself becomes a weapon. Reinforcements moved rapidly toward the weak point.